Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a question that has haunted every civilization from Athens to modern-day America. What truly separates a great leader from a tyrant? At first glance, the answer might seem obvious, but history has a way of blurring the lines, doesn't it? One man's liberator is another man's despot. So how do we tell the difference? Let's begin with a framework that's as old as political philosophy itself, Aristotle. He offered a crucial distinction. True rulers, he argued, govern for the good of the people. Tyrants, on the other hand, govern for themselves. That's it, not a matter of titles or charisma or even military success, but intent. Who benefits from their power? The many or the one? But that's just the start. If we want to really evaluate leadership, we need a set of criteria. We'll look at personal ambition. Was the ruler obsessed with glory? We'll explore how they treated dissent. Did they tolerate opposition or crush it? We'll examine their use of violence. Was it strategic or indiscriminate? We'll assess how much liberty they allowed, economic and civil. And finally, we'll look at their legacy. What kind of world did they leave behind? Because here's the twist, it's not just about personality. Great intentions can be undone by terrible systems, and ruthless men can rise precisely because of the incentives baked into those systems. So our foundational thesis today is this: structures, incentives, and moral foundations are just as important as the individual in charge, if not more, because in the end, leadership and tyranny aren't just about who holds power, they're about how and why they hold it. Let's get into it. Let's start with the world these men were born into, or more importantly, the world that was collapsing around them. Napoleon Bonaparte and Joseph Stalin didn't rise in times of peace and order. They rose from the ashes of revolution. And revolutions, as dramatic and idealistic as they may seem, tend to leave behind one thing above all else: a power vacuum. After the French Revolution tore down the monarchy, the old institutions that held France together were either dead or dying. Chaos reigned. Factions fought for control. The guillotine didn't build a stable democracy, it created a void. And Napoleon, with his military genius and iron will, stepped into that void. Stalin's story is eerily similar. After the Russian Revolution toppled the Tsar, the Bolsheviks seized power. But their victory unleashed more than just a new government, it opened the door to brutal factional infighting. Lenin's death accelerated that chaos, and Stalin, with his mastery of bureaucratic warfare and ideological control, filled the vacuum. But revolutions don't just remove rulers, they replace entire worldviews. Both France and Russia substituted monarchies with ideologically centralized regimes. In France, it was the vision of republicanism, nationalism, and secular law. In Russia, it was Marxism-Leninism, a doctrine that didn't just want to reform society, but to remake it from the ground up. And here's where the systems come in. Napoleon gave France the Napoleonic Code, a sweeping legal reform that standardized law across the country. It promised order and rationality, but also cemented state authority. Stalin, meanwhile, issued Bolshevik decrees that rewired every part of Soviet life: property, speech, labor. His system was built not on liberty, but on control. Economically, both leaders drew blueprints that restructured their nations. Napoleon's state capitalism aimed to stabilize post-feudal France and support his military ambitions. Stalin's war socialism and five-year plans forced rapid industrialization at a horrific human cost. So what do we learn here? Revolutions may promise freedom, but without stable institutions and thoughtful design, they often create the perfect storm for autocrats to rise. And the incentives built into those post-revolutionary systems? They often reward the boldest, the most ruthless, and the least constrained by moral restraint. Let's move forward, because the way these men handled power once they had it tells us even more. Once in power, how do you keep it? For Napoleon and Stalin, the answer was clear: you silence your enemies, and you do it thoroughly. Napoleon used military police and secret agents to monitor dissent. Censorship was standard. Newspapers were shut down or forced into obedience. Opposition figures? Exiled or eliminated. He didn't just rule France, he controlled its narrative. Stalin took this to a horrifying extreme. Under his regime, surveillance wasn't just a tool, it was a way of life. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, institutionalized terror. They didn't just monitor, they purged. Tens of thousands were executed during the Great Purge. Millions were imprisoned in labor camps. Accusation alone could mean death. Loyalty wasn't protection, it was a performance, and failure to play the role could cost you everything. And what did this climate of fear do to society? It froze it. People became afraid to speak, to innovate, to question. Fear is a terrible incentive structure. It paralyzes creativity, erodes trust, and reduces human potential to mere survival. In both France and the Soviet Union, this repression didn't just target individuals. It poisoned entire cultures, but the cracks always show, and in the shadows, voices endured. Memoirs, underground writings, whispered conversations, these became acts of resistance. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for example, survived the Gulag system and wrote of its horrors with brutal clarity. His words didn't just expose Stalin's brutality, they reminded the world that truth can survive even the darkest regimes. So what separates a leader from a tyrant? Perhaps it's this: a leader can tolerate criticism. A tyrant cannot, because criticism, in their eyes, is not just disagreement, it's a threat to their control. And that control, once challenged, begins to unravel. Next, we'll see how that obsession with control extended not just to people, but to entire economies. Now let's talk economics, because tyranny isn't just enforced through soldiers or secret police. It's also embedded in how a society feeds, employs, and taxes its people. Both Napoleon and Stalin understood that to control a nation, you had to control its economy. Napoleon created the Bank of France to stabilize the economy after revolutionary chaos. It centralized financial power and helped fund his wars. But make no mistake, it wasn't a free market. This was a state-guided system, designed to serve the ambitions of an expanding empire. Stalin went even further. He launched the infamous 5-year plans and enforced collectivization across the Soviet Union. Private farms were seized. The state dictated production targets. Workers were reassigned by central command. The goal wasn't prosperity, it was control. Stalin's economy became a machine, not to generate wealth, but to reinforce the power of the state. But when central planning replaces voluntary exchange, distortions always follow. Inefficiencies, shortages, and inflation plagued both systems. In Stalin's Soviet Union, black markets exploded, not because people were greedy, but because the official economy couldn't provide basic goods. When prices aren't set by supply and demand, they're set by guesswork. And guesswork, even with spreadsheets and slogans, leads to chaos. And the human cost? Devastating. In Ukraine, collectivization and grain requisitioning sparked the Holodomor, a man-made famine that killed millions. People starved in one of the most fertile regions on Earth. Why? Because the state prioritized quotas over lives. Economic planning may promise fairness, but when driven by authoritarian control, it doesn't just fail to deliver, it destroys. So again we ask, is the problem the individual, or the system that empowers them? Let's move into how these leaders shaped not only their economies, but their very images. Because the next step in control is making yourself more than a ruler. It's making yourself a symbol. At some point, raw power isn't enough. To rule absolutely, you need more than obedience. You need belief. That's where the cult of personality comes in. Napoleon wasn't just a general, he became a myth. He crowned himself emperor in a lavish ceremony that dripped with symbolism. Paintings, sculptures, medals, and public ceremonies all reinforce the image of Napoleon as not just a man, but a force of destiny. He controlled not just armies, but imaginations. Stalin took this to an industrial scale. His face was everywhere, on walls, on coins, in classrooms. Children learned poems praising him. Cities were renamed in his honor. Artists, filmmakers, even scientists were pressured to credit him for breakthroughs. History was rewritten to erase rivals and exaggerate his achievements. And if anyone dared to question it, they disappeared. But here's the deeper danger of the cult of personality: it replaces truth with theater. When a nation worships a person instead of principles, it loses its anchor. Criticism becomes treason. Flaws are denied, not corrected. Power isn't checked, it's sanctified. And that paves the road for disaster, because the ruler becomes unchallengeable, even when they're wrong. Contrast this with principle-based leadership. Leaders like George Washington, who refused to become a king, understood that systems matter more than personalities. They placed their legacy in the hands of constitutions, laws, and institutions designed to outlive them. But tyrants? They write their legacy in portraits and parades. And when they fall, their nations are often left with little more than ruins and statues to tear down. So ask yourself, do you want a leader who builds systems, or one who builds shrines? Up next, we'll examine how these legacies are judged by history, and how propaganda doesn't always die with the dictator. Now comes the part that outlasts even the most powerful tyrant, the legacy. But here's the catch: legacy isn't history. It's what history chooses to remember. And that choice? It's often shaped by the victors, the institutions, and the regimes that survive. Take Napoleon. In France, he's remembered with a strange blend of admiration and critique. Some praise his legal reforms, his military brilliance, even his modernization of the state. Others see him as a warmonger who plunged Europe into years of brutal conflict. Walk through Paris and you'll find monuments to him, but look deeper, and you'll find graveyards filled because of him. Stalin's legacy is even more fractured. In Russia, you'll find statues still standing. Polls show that many Russians view him as a symbol of strength, especially during World War II. He's remembered as the man who industrialized the Soviet Union, who led the country to victory over Hitler. But those same textbooks often downplay the purges, the gulags, and the famines. Entire chapters of suffering are reduced to footnotes or erased altogether. This isn't just historical spin, it's legacy laundering. When regimes or national identities are built on myth, they need those myths to survive. So history becomes selective, victims are forgotten, failures are rebranded, and the next generation grows up with a version of the past that supports the current power structure. And here's the truly chilling part. These legacies don't just reflect the past, they shape the future. Authoritarians around the world study men like Stalin and Napoleon. They borrow their tactics, their rhetoric, even their aesthetics. The blueprint survives, even if the man does not. So ask yourself, who writes the textbooks? Who funds the museums? Who decides what a child learns about the past? History may be written by the victors, but the truth has a way of whispering through the cracks. Next, we're going to zoom out and compare systems themselves, the patterns that produce tyrants over and over again, no matter the time or place. Now let's pull back the curtain, not on the individuals, but on the systems that made them possible. Because tyranny doesn't rise out of thin air, it feeds on patterns. First, look for power without accountability. In systems where there are no checks, no balances, no consequences, the worst types of leaders often rise to the top. Why? Because those are the people most willing to do whatever it takes to seize and hold power. In a system that rewards ruthlessness, guess who wins? Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, put it bluntly, in a centralized regime, the scariest truth is that the worst get on top, not by accident, but by design. Now look at how these systems handle truth. In free societies, truth is messy, there's debate, disagreement, even outrage, but that chaos allows correction. In authoritarian systems, truth is streamlined, sanitized, controlled. The press becomes a mouthpiece, history becomes a script, and anyone who deviates becomes a threat. Next, observe how these systems treat the individual. In tyranny, you are not a person, you are a cog. Your thoughts, your labor, even your children, belong to the state. Dissent isn't just discouraged, it's criminalized. The system survives by crushing anything unpredictable. Compare that with systems that elevate the individual, where rights are protected, where property is secure, where leadership is earned, not inherited or seized. These systems may not be perfect, but they contain self-correcting mechanisms. They allow for renewal without revolution. And here's the haunting pattern we see across time: when institutions break down, when economic crises erupt, when fear takes hold, people are more likely to trade freedom for security. And tyrants are always ready to make that deal. The question is, will we recognize the pattern before it repeats? We've walked through revolutions, repression, propaganda, and legacy. So now it's time to ask, what really matters more, the person at the top, or the system beneath them? Napoleon and Stalin were radically different in many ways. Different eras, different ideologies, different methods. And yet, so many of their behaviors were the same. Why? Because the structures that elevated them, those post-revolutionary power vacuums, those centralized institutions, those unchecked levers of control, made their rise not only possible, but predictable. So maybe the real warning from history isn't just beware of tyrants. Maybe it's beware of the systems that make tyranny easy. When freedom is fragile, when dissent is dangerous, when all roads lead to one ruler and there's no off-ramp, that's when history starts rhyming again. So here's what we leave you with. What kind of incentives does your system create? Does it reward truth or loyalty? Does it foster transparency or control? Does it elevate leaders or manufacture idols? And maybe the most important question of all, if tyranny returned tomorrow, would we even notice until it was too late? If you've enjoyed this exploration, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know what historical patterns you see repeating today. And check out the other videos on truth behind history, where we dig deep into the past, not to glorify it, but to learn what it's really trying to tell us. Thanks for watching.